So welcome everyone. Wow, it is wonderful to see all of you. We have 82 people attending so far and they're still coming. My name is Trish Feth and I am the Communication and Program Specialist with the Northern Virginia Soil and Water Conservation District, and I am thrilled to be here this morning with all of you. We also have Heather Shackley, our Operations Manager here, and she's going to be helping out this morning. Let me just introduce our speaker for today. Sam Hoadley is the Manager of Horticultural Research at Mount Cuba Center, where he evaluates native plant species, old and new cultivars, and hybrids in the Trial Garden. He is the manager of the Trial Garden. Sam earned his degree in sustainable landscape horticulture from the University of Vermont. And he has a wonderful presentation. I know it's a little bit gray and drizzly. This is going to be the cure for that today because this is eye candy galore. It is a beautiful presentation and it is chock full of great information. So thank you all for joining us. And without any further anything else from me, we'll turn it over to Sam.
All right. Thank you so much, Trish. Here, let me pull up my presentation here. All right. Does that look good?
Looks great.
All right, great. All right. Well, thank you. First of all, thank you all so much for having me this morning. It is a pleasure to be here talking with you all about knockout natives. This presentation is going to be talking about some of the best plants from a lot of our previous trials, but we're also going to include some previews on some of our ongoing trials and trials that have just finished, including our trials on ironweed and solidago. So the presentation is going to kind of start off with an introduction to Mount Cuba Center, who we are, how our mission ties into what we do in the Trial Garden. I'm also going to talk a little bit about how we conduct the trials, how we look at plants both from an ornamental perspective and an ecological perspective. We're going to talk about those previews, talk about some of those plants that are currently in the Trial Garden, and then finally we're going to jump into some of our most recently concluded trials, again, talking about the best of the best. And I think we'll have a good chunk of time for questions at the end. And one thing I do want to mention, though, if I don't answer a question or if you think of something later, my contact information is right here on this title slide, the shoadley@mtcubacenter.org. Please feel free to reach out. Happy to chat with you anytime about plants, or the trials or Mount Cuba in general. So with that, we'll get going. So for those of you who haven't been to Mount Cuba Center, first of all, I would highly encourage you to come visit. And if you do come visit, let me know. I'd love to show you around. We have a lot going on at Mount Cuba Center these days. We just finished a brand new production and greenhouse facility. It's really state of the art, supposed to be a net zero facility. It's really fabulous, and we're going to be able to do many more collaborations in terms of native plant conservation with national parks and other organizations, which is something we've been doing in the past, but we're going to do a lot more of. But just a brief history of Mount Cuba Center. We are the former estate of the DuPont Copeland family. They moved to this area in the 1930s from Litchfield, Connecticut. And they started by building this house in what was at the time a fallow cornfield on the top of this hill here in northern Delaware. And after that, they started building gardens. You can actually see this kind of formal south garden here was one of the first gardens that was built. And they started eventually moving into the woodlands, creating naturalistic gardens, and realized quickly that native plants were really starting to become their focus. They were their favorites. They were passionate about conservation. They were passionate about conserving open space. And they started doing a lot of that in their home gardens. And they realized quickly as well that they eventually wanted their home garden to be open to the public. And they wanted Mount Cuba Center, or what was eventually going to become Mount Cuba Center, to be a place where people would be inspired by the beauty and value of native plants, and hopefully inspire conservation action by the visitors as well. So in 2013 was the first time we've opened our doors to regular visitation, and everything we do at Mount Cuba Center, whether that's our educational programs, in our naturalistic gardens, our formal gardens, or even what we do in the Trial Garden, ties back to this mission of inspiring appreciation for the beauty and value of native plants. And that's exactly what we do in the Trial Garden. If you think about inspiring appreciation for the beauty, those ornamental qualities of these plants, when you come to the Trial Garden, you see what a beautiful plant that is. You want to plant it in your home landscape, but we also want to inspire people by the value of those plants. And most of the time, we interpret value as how those plants could support wildlife in cultivation in the Mid-Atlantic region. And most of the time, we're looking at pollinator interactions with various species and cultivars that we have in the trial garden, trying to understand which of those plants are able to best attract insects and likely are best able to support insects in cultivation. So a little bit more on those two perspectives later. But again, what we do, we're evaluating native plant species and cultivars and hybrids from the mid-Atlantic region for their horticultural and ecological value. You may hear me use the word nativars. You're probably all familiar with this term. Nativars is essentially just a term for a native plant cultivar, essentially a cultivated form of a plant that has been selected or bred for stable or desirable traits. So Mount Cuba Center's trial program, here's an aerial view of the trial garden itself. It's about 1/3 of an acre. About 2/3 of that space is made up by a full sun garden, and we have about 1/3 of that space which is underneath a shade structure. The shade structure allows us to do a lot of things. We can evaluate plants that need to be grown in shade, which we currently have our fern trial growing underneath, or we have that flexibility of being able to grow a trial in both shade and sun and compare and contrast the performance of all those plants in both of those conditions. We are a non-biased and self-funded trial program. Essentially, we will take plants donations, but with that understanding that we are going to communicate exactly how they perform in the garden. There's never any preferential treatment given to any of these plants, and they are really kind of planted, and then it's very hands-off. Why we do this, we want to inform the public, so home gardeners, you and me, and the nursery trade, to promote native plants that perform well in this region. We want people to be successful when gardening with native plants, so they'll want to continue to grow more native plants and add to their home landscape, continue to add that conservation value at home. How we do this, most of our trial are genera based, although we have gotten away from that a little bit, but that has been the theme in the past. A lot of them have been large genera or genera that have a lot of cultivars present. But in the recent, some of our more recent trials with ferns, we're looking at a lot of genera together, and we're also planning a trial on grasses, which will incorporate both Schizocarium and Andropogon. Our definition of native in the trial garden and at Mount Cuba Center is the eastern United States, or more specifically, the eastern temperate forest region, which is a rather large definition of native. But what it allows us to do is incorporate as many plants as we possibly can in the trial garden, test them in these conditions, and be able to tell people if it's worthwhile growing in your home landscape, if you will be successful with them. Essentially, let us make the mistakes for you. We'll be able to tell you which plants work and which plants don't. Trials generally run for 3 to 5 years. There are exceptions to this, and we're going to be talking about one of them in the next few slides. And the trial garden is low to no maintenance after that first year. During the first year, we water sparingly to basically get these plants established. After that, it is hands off. We aren't using any pesticides on these plants at all, no fertilizers, no additions to these plants. We want to see how these plants are going to perform in a very, very low input setting so that you'll have the same success with these plants with the same amount of input that we do in the trial garden, which is very, very limited. So horticultural data collection, again, this is how we're measuring the beauty of these native plants. During the growing season, we're observing these plants on a weekly basis, and during every week, we are measuring these plants, we're observing them, and we're assigning ratings on several different features of these plants. The first rating is assigned for the overall plant score, and I kind of think of that as everything that plant is doing when it's not in bloom. Think about its foliage, its habit, whether it's upright, whether it's floppy. All of those things are kind of incorporated into that score. And all these scores are on a scale of 1 to 5. Just to kind of give you a calibration here, a 1 is the lowest score you could achieve, a 5 is the highest, and a 3 is average, right down the middle. A 3 is not a bad score. I say this all the time. There are a lot of plants that are scoring around that 3 threshold that I would happily grow in my home landscape. But most of the plants that we categorize as top performers that we're promoting at the end of these evaluations, they end up in that 4 to 5 range there. So these are truly excellent plants. So again, we're assigning that score of the overall plant every single week. When the plants are in bloom during that growing season, we assign a separate floral score, again on a scale of 1 to 5, and this is just for the ornamental qualities of that flower display. The color, the coverage, how long those blooms are lasting, all of those things are taken into account. And then disease resistance can also sometimes be a third field of rating. And this This resistance rating is really important for trials like Phlox or Monarda, where we have a disease that's known in cultivation, like powdery mildew, that can be a major consideration for home gardeners. For some trials, disease is not really a factor, like for wild hydrangeas or for carex, really no disease pressures were observed, but for some it becomes very important. At the end of each year, all of those scores are then averaged together. Generally, they're weighted 50%. It's the overall plant score, 25% is the floral score, and 25% is disease resistance. After the end of those 3 years or 5 years, all of those yearly scores are then averaged together, and that's how we determine our top performing plants. And this is generally the top 10, although that number kind of changes a little bit from trial to trial. But again, these are generally the best of the best, those plants that are scoring between that 4 to 5 range. And once we have those top performers identified, we release a research report, which is all on our website, available for free PDF download. We also have hard copies at Mount Cuba Center that you can purchase when you come to visit us. And in addition to those research reports on the website, we have detailed information on every single plant that's ever gone through our trial gardens. And that includes the plants that didn't perform well. And in many cases, we try to discuss why that plant maybe didn't perform well and maybe where you could cite it that it could perform a little bit better. So pollinator data collection, and this is how we're measuring the value of these native plants in most situations. We are looking at ways to evaluate these plants' abilities to host native insects moving forward, especially when we're talking about our Asclepias trial that just started, looking at monarchs specifically. But most of the time, what we have done is we've looked at the pollinator interactions between the various species and cultivars in the trial garden. And the way we're able to collect this data is through a pollinator watch team. This is a dedicated team of volunteer citizen scientists who are observing and recording pollinator visitations on our various trials. They're observing these plants on a near daily basis when they're in bloom, counting the number of insects that are coming to an inflorescence or an entire plant, and trying to gauge these plants' abilities to attract insects. Sometimes it's all of the insects combined that are coming to these plants. Sometimes we're looking at specific categories. And in some cases, most recently, we've actually been looking at specialists, specific species of insects that are coming to a specific genera of plants that we are kind of honing in on and trying to understand their interactions most. And then I'll have a little bit more information on one of those interactions in the next few slides. So far, we've observed pollinator interaction with the pollinator watch team on Monarda, Phlox, Helenium, Echinacea, wild hydrangea, and we just finished data on Vernonia and Solidago, and I have some preview slides for both of those trials and their ability to attract pollinators coming up. So far, these are the completed trials that we've done here at Mount Cuba Center. All of the information on all of these trials is available on the website, but the trials highlighted in orange are the ones we're going to be talking about a little more in detail today. Quick preview on Vernonia. So far, for over this trial, we evaluated 45 Vernonia accessions, including species and cultivars. Data collection began in 2021, and we were looking for superior habit and form from these plants, pollinator preference, and disease resistance. A lot of these plants get rust really badly, especially towards the middle to end of summer, which is kind of very appropriate when you think about a plant that's called ironweed getting rust. But really a great trial. A lot of diversity in this genus. This has been a really fun one. And this report is scheduled for release in 2025. Look for this around January of next year. So Vernonia pollinator data. We saw heavy visitation from bees and small butterflies, in particular skippers, but there was one native bee that was really interesting to us, and this is Melissodes denticulatus, which is pictured here. This is a Vernonia specialist bee. So this bee relies on the pollen of Vernonia to feed its larvae, and it relies on this genus of plants to support the survival of its species specifically. So we've seen this Vernonia specialist bee in the trial garden, and in 2022 and in 2023, we observed them specifically to try to understand which of these species and cultivars, they have 45 options in the trial garden, which of these species and cultivars are attracting the Melissodes the most. And in theory, we'd be able to tell people which Vernonia they could plant in their home landscape to support this insect best. So just a couple quick slides on the Melisodes denticulatus. This is a really interesting bee, and just to kind of give you an idea about size, they're about 2/3 to maybe half the size of a honeybee. They're black and white, and they move rather quickly. They hover around the flowers, and the male and female insects can appear quite different. On the left-hand side, we have the female bee, and really the characteristic ID feature of that bee is the hind legs of the female bees are always packed with that white pollen. Vernonia produces white pollen, and the female bees are collecting that pollen to bring back to their larvae to feed their young. And if you zoom in really close, they have these incredible cobalt blue eyes. The males, on the other hand, on the right-hand side, they are not collecting pollen. They are simply nectaring, and they are looking for mates. And you can see the common name for this insect is denticulate longhorn bee. You can see where the name longhorn comes from when you see the antenna on that male bee. But this is a relatively common insect. If you see Vernonia in the wild in your home garden, you will probably see this insect. So keep an eye out for it. But again, some interesting data going forward in these next few slides about which Vernonia this insect prefers. So these are the pollinator watch data for 2023. That green line represents the total pollinators that we observed over time in all of the Vernonia. But what I wanted to show you here is that blue line, and this is the total number of Melisodes. And this is something we've seen repeat over the last 2 years, is that the Melisodes have a very specific window of activity, which really kind of takes up the month of August. We see a handful of them towards the middle to end of July, but the numbers really do peak in kind of beginning towards the end of August, and then they taper off towards the end of September. And this makes a lot of sense. This kind of seasonal activity, that kind of peak of activity during the month of August lines up perfectly with some of our locally native ironweeds. That includes New York ironweed, Vernonia glauca. So these species of plants and insects have co-evolved together, and in our local areas, they are interacting together during a very specific window of time. And this kind of shows you that some plants that aren't locally native to the mid-Atlantic region are maybe blooming out of sync with this Melisodes window of activity. Some of the earlier blooming plants like Vernonia fasciculata is blooming a little bit too early for the Melisodes. Later blooming plants like Vernonia gigantea and Vernonia angustifolia are blooming a little bit later. We see hardly any Melisodes activity. So if you do want to be supporting this insect, plant a Vernonia that's in bloom during that August window, and you're going to be supporting this insect. And again, here's the phenology chart for all of the different Vernonia that were in the trial garden. And this circle really does represent when we're seeing the most Melisodes. Again, New York ironweed is right there in the core of it. Vernonia arkansana, we saw a lot of Melisodes activity. Vernonia baldwinii, the same. But again, these locally native Vernonia seem to be very well suited to support this very specialized insect in our region. In terms of most visited Vernonia by insects in general, we had kind of a monopoly by several species in the trial garden as far as their ability to attract total pollinators. Vernonia fasciculata showed up a lot in the top 12 most visited Vernonia, and that was one of the first blooming plants in the trial garden. There's very few other options in the trial garden at that time, and when they start blooming, we see a lot of insects, not necessarily Melisodes, but a lot of small bees and bumblebees as well. Vernonia baldwinii is heavily visited, as is Vernonia gigantea. More to come on this. Again, stay tuned on our website in January next year. We'll have a much more detailed breakdown. And this is the preliminary data that's coming out right now. A little bit of a preview on the Solidago trial. We looked at 70 different goldenrods and their allies, including Euthymia and Brintonia, which has now been lumped back into Solidago. We're looking for horticultural value and pollinator preference. Data collection began in spring of 2021, so exact same timeline as the Vernonia trial. And this report is scheduled to be released in January of 2026. So the Solidago pollinator data, overall, the Solidago have been visited by a huge variety of pollinators. Relatively few butterflies, but we saw everything else. We saw a lot of really interesting specialists. We actually saw caterpillars using these plants as host plants. Just an incredible amount of wildlife is supported by goldenrods, and we're really hoping that through promoting goldenrods for garden usage, people will kind of get over that idea that goldenrods are weedy or they cause allergies, which is totally false, and want to plant more goldenrods and support more wildlife in their home garden. One thing we did see a very interesting and strong preference in was the bumblebee preference and activity in the trial garden. Some of these goldenrods attracted more bumblebees than anything else. And in times when we had many goldenrods blooming, bumblebees would be on 2 or 3 species and ignore all of the rest. We would see lots of other insects, lots of other smaller bees on the others, but bumblebees seem to have a very strong preference amongst those trials. More data to come on that. And here is the Pollinator Watch data from 2023. There's a lot going on here, a lot to unpack, and we'll be sharing more of that, more of those kind of take-home lessons once this research report comes out. But one thing I really wanted to point out to you here is just look at how long the season is. For 70 different goldenrods, we have the first goldenrod starting to bloom on May 22nd and the last one ending bloom on November 19th. For a single genus, that is a huge window. And you can kind of strategically pick different goldenrods throughout the entire season so that you can have goldenrods blooming in your garden for an extremely prolonged period in your garden that aren't just looking beautiful, but they're supporting wildlife as well. And just a quick preview on the most visited goldenrods: Solidago leavenworthii, Ridellii, Curtisii. So these are some of the best plants that we saw a huge amount of pollinator data, or pollinator visits on. One plant, Solidago fistulosa, which is the last one down there that's highlighted. Really great species, native to the coastal plain of the eastern US. And it is a great plant that is underrepresented in horticulture. It's one of our top performers, but it is not commercially available. And this is one we're trying to get out to nurseries now. So by the time our research report comes out, hopefully people can purchase this plant. It's a really, really excellent locally native species, appropriate for a lot of places in our region, especially the coastal zones. So stay tuned for that one. It's a really, really exciting plant. And a quick preview, if you came to Mount Cuba Center today, or when we open on April 3rd, these are the plants that you would get to see in the trial garden right now. These are the plants that we are evaluating as we speak. The oak leaf hydrangeas for the Mid-Atlantic region, a bigger trial on only one species. Again, we're looking at all of the genetic variation that exists in cultivation for oak leaf hydrangeas. We looked at 25 cultivars. We have one plant of known wild origin from Alabama, and we have one commercially sourced straight species. We don't know its origin. We don't know how it's being produced, but we have those few layers of comparison. And we're beginning year 2 of a 5-year evaluation. Next up, we have Asclepias for the Mid-Atlantic region. We have 25 commercially available milkweeds, 10 species, and 7 cultivars. We're really heavily focused on Asclepias tuberosa, or butterfly weed, and Asclepias incarnata. We saw a ton of monarch activity in this trial last year. We were essentially allowing these plants to get established, but we will start collecting data both from an ornamental perspective and from an ecological perspective, with a special focus on monarch activity, both adults and larvae. Again, trying to determine which of these plants is best able to support monarchs in cultivation. If you have limited space, is there one that you can pick that's going to support monarchs the best? And we're hoping to be able to share that story with you a little bit later. We also are doing a trial in Physostegia. We have 14 commercially available obedient plants, including 5 species and 8 cultivars. There's a lot of obedient plant cultivars out there. Are they created equal? Are there some that are better suited for the Mid-Atlantic region? Are there some that are better behaved than others? Very exciting trial. And also we'll have a pollinator component. We are also looking at Tiarella. These were 18 commercially sourced foam flowers, 2 species and 15 cultivars planted this past April. And then ferns for the Mid-Atlantic region, which I'm really excited about. I don't know a whole lot about ferns, so this is really kind of a great learning opportunity for me. This includes 62 commercially available ferns, 39 species and 15 cultivars. There's a lot of ferns down here, and I think it's going to start looking like Jurassic Park this year. It's just going to be this lush jungle of ferns down in the trial garden after they've been established for a whole year. But a really, really cool trial. A lot of examples of cultivated ferns. We actually have some nursery sources where the ferns are of known origin, so we have those layers of comparison as well in this trial. And then finally, the trial that I'm most excited about, we just planted this last fall in October, is Pycnanthemum for the Mid-Atlantic region. We included 42 different mountain mints, 16 species, and 4 cultivars. There is going to be a lot of pollinator activity this year in the trial garden. I cannot wait. Pycnanthemum are some of my favorite garden plants. They are easy to grow. Some of them are more aggressive than others, but there is a place for every mountain mint in cultivation. But I'm just more fascinated than anything about seeing the pollinator interactions between these various species and cultivars we're planting. So great time to see these will be this summer. They look like they've all overwintered really well, so stay tuned for that. And on to our trial results. We're going to kind of go back in time in order. Our most recently concluded trial was on Amsonia. And when I talked about our general trial window being about 3 to 5 years, Amsonia broke the mold a little bit. This trial lasted 10 years. So this is 2013 to 2023, and we looked at 20 different Amsonia over that period of time. They were sited in an area that's kind of on that blurred border between part sun and full sun. So we didn't see some of the traits like really excellent fall color, which is really best displayed when you have Amsonia planted in full sun. But these plants survived, and they didn't just survive, they got better and better and better. And all of those plants that we planted at the beginning of that trial are still there 10 years later. These are tough plants, they're long-lived, they're great garden plants, not necessarily native to the Mid-Atlantic region. Some of them, Amsonia tabernae montana, ekes into Virginia, but all of the plants that we evaluated are great garden plants in this region, and they do support wildlife here as well. This evaluation primarily focused on the ornamental qualities of these plants, although we did do pollinator observations just this last spring. Just a brief background on the genus Amsonia. Depending on the source and the taxonomy, which seems to be in a state of flux right now. And just a quick note, I'm going to be presenting the names of these plants that we are currently using at Mount Cuba Center in 2023 and early 2024. Some of these are subject to change, and when I come to some of these, I will try to mention the alternative and probably most current name that will be in use going forward. But most of this genus is found in North America. One species is found in Greece and Turkey, which is Amsonia orientalis, and one species from Japan, which is Amsonia elliptica. For the first time ever, we have included a plant that is not native to North America at all in our trials, and that was Amsonia orientalis. We included that in this evaluation to serve as a comparison plant for a plant called Amsonia blue ice. And I'm sure many of you have heard of that plant. That plant has an interesting history in horticulture. It was found at White Flower Farm in Connecticut decades ago. It's been in cultivation for a long time and has gone under many different names since then. Some people have advertised it as a dwarf cultivar of Amsonia tabernae montana, which is a species native to the Midwestern and Eastern United States. Some people say it's a hybrid, but just based on anecdotal observations, blue ice appeared and sounded very similar to the non-native species Amsonia orientalis. So we decided to include that species planted next to it to try to highlight some of the similarities and differences between the two, and a little bit more on that comparison in a future slide. Amsonia belong to the Apocynaceae plant family. Its relatives include Vinca, Hoya, and Asclepius. And all our Amsonia are herbaceous perennials, and they emerge from a woody crown called a caudex in spring. This is an example of the phenology on Amsonia. We have some very early blooming plants, including Amsonia ciliata variety tenuifolia and Amsonia tabernae montana variety tabernae montana, which begin blooming sometimes in early April here, most of the time in mid-April, go all the way to late May. Some of the other species, like the ever-popular Amsonia hebrictii, Amsonia ciliata, and some of the other varieties of tabernae montana start in early May and go into mid-June. And finally, we have Amsonia orientalis and blue ice that start blooming in mid-May and end in late June. So here's one of the similarities already between Amsonia orientalis, a non-native plant native to Europe, and the Amsonia blue ice, which again is sometimes advertised as being a native species. But if you want to come see these plants in the trial garden, they will be in the trial garden for one more year. The best time to come see them in full bloom is mid-May to late May at Mount Cuba Center. We did do pollinator observations on the Amsonia trial, and we actually saw relatively low numbers, especially when you're comparing the total number of pollinators to a trial like Solidago or Vernonia, where we saw dozens of pollinators sometimes in a single observation. Now, there are some reasons that we think could be attributed to the low pollinator numbers on the Amsonia. One of them is just simply that the trial was sited in a slightly shadier location. Other places at Mount Cuba Center where Amsonia were in full sun, we saw much more pollinator activity. And the pollinator activity as well seemed to be very seasonal in the trial garden. We saw a bigger uptick in pollinator activity sort of end of May and early June, especially from bumblebees, but we did see a very interesting diversity of insects. We actually saw migrating monarch butterflies, excuse me. We did see hummingbirds as well. We saw hummingbird moths. And the other thing too is we were interested in maybe we were missing a nocturnal pollinator component as well, which we think is a possibility and is something we've never observed for in the past, but I could see observing for in the future. But this hummingbird moth that I mentioned earlier, this is one of my favorite insects to see in the trial garden, just an absolutely charismatic species of moth. And this is actually the snowberry clearwing hummingbird moth. And it was great to see the adults out here because we knew that the caterpillars of the species actually can use Amsonia as a host plant. The caterpillars will eat the foliage of Amsonia. We know that's a possibility. It happens throughout the range of Amsonia, but we hadn't seen it happen until last year. We actually did see caterpillars of the snowberry clearwing feeding on Amsonia foliage at Mount Cuba Center. A huge caterpillar, very charismatic species, and very exciting, again, to see Amsonia supporting wildlife, not just as a pollinator plant, but as a host plant. Just a brief review on some of the species. And one of the kind of things I haven't mentioned about the Amsonia trial is out of the 20 plants that we evaluated, I think they could all be determined to be a top performer. Almost all of them ended up in that 4 to 5 range. They were all great garden plants. And instead of telling you, these are the 10 that performed really well in this region, maybe pick from this list. It's really, they're all great plants, and maybe you might have to choose them based on their mature size, when they flower, your kind of aesthetic needs, or even which ones are attracting more insects than others. The first species here is Amsonia ciliata, which occurs in the southeastern United States and south central. Really beautiful plant if you are familiar with Amsonia hubrichtii and that kind of fine foliage. This is slightly coarser than hubrichtii, but it still gives you that fine texture. And Amsonia ciliata is a rather large plant that can take up a big space in your home garden. I do think of Amsonia as almost kind of a woody plant that comes in kind of an herbaceous form. When you plant it, you want to be careful to plant where it's going to live for a long period of time. They are difficult to move and divide, although you can do it, but it's best to kind of plant that plant where it's going to stay for a long period of time. But Amsonia ciliata is a lovely plant. There are some other cultivars in the trial garden that did very similar things, such as Halfway to Arkansas and Midway to Montana, both great alternatives to Amsonia ciliata. And again, big plant. This gets to 4 to 5 feet tall, 6 to 7 feet wide overall, really large species, and potentially has great fall color. Again, would probably be best shown in full sun. And there is a variety of Amsonia ciliata called variety tenuifolia. It occurs in a similar range, but they are very small plants, and they occur in very harsh growing conditions, typically very nutrient poor, very sandy, very sunny. And Amsonia ciliata variety tenuifolia is very small. Again, kind of a miniaturized version of Amsonia hubrichtii, gets to about 2 feet tall, 2 to 3 feet wide, very fine thread-like foliage. And you can see this picture of ciliata tenuifolia taken at Mount Cuba Center on a rock wall garden. This plant self-sowed directly into a crack of the bedrock. So very inhospitable place, but it is growing beautifully. Could be great in a rock garden or even planted in a large container on a permanent basis. If you don't have a lot of space, this is an Amsonia that could be a really good fit for you. And this is a cultivar of Amsonia ciliata called Spring Sky, really larger, bigger, bluer flowers. Up next is Amsonia hubrichtii, kind of restricted to the Ozark region, kind of right on the edge, what we consider to be native to the eastern temperate forest region. And it is a rather rare plant in the wild. And despite this rarity, despite the fact that it's really growing in this one locality in the Ozark region, this plant has proven to be very adaptable in cultivation and is great in gardens in the mid-Atlantic region and beyond. Very fine thread-like foliage, interesting flowers, but the foliage and the fall color is really what you grow this plant for. And again, just to give you a comparison of the foliage width, this is a leaf of Amsonia hebrictii that's circled here compared to a few other plants in the trial garden, including Amsonia ciliata, Amsonia tabernae montana variety tabernae montana, and a few of the other varieties, including illustris and salicifolia on the left. Again, that foliage is absolutely spectacular, and this is really one of the finest features of Amsonia hebrictii is its fall color when grown in full sun. And this is a planting of Amsonia hebrictii in our meadow garden here at Mount Cuba Center. It is absolutely spectacular, worth growing the species for alone. And then Amsonia tabernae montana has the largest range of any of the Amsonia species that we're going to be talking about today. Most of that range in the Northeast are thought to be naturalized populations, and primarily the species is native to the Midwest, South Central, and Southeastern United States. We're going to be talking about 3 different varieties today that we had in the trial garden. The first of which is variety illustris, which will very likely be made into or elevated to its own species, which will just be referred to as Amsonia illustris. This is native more closely to where Amsonia hebrictii is, sort of in the central U.S. Very interesting plant, larger growing plant, and has these beautiful, shiny, undulating leaves, which you can see here. Really attractive feature of this plant. Amsonia tabernae montana variety salicifolia, slightly smaller version, overlaps in range with Amsonia tabernae montana variety tabernae montana in the southeastern United States. Beautiful plant species, often has these dark stems and darker blue foliage, and the term salicifolia means willow leaf, which it absolutely does, but it is lacking that kind of shiny leaf surface and that undulating leaf margin that Amsonia illustris does on the right-hand side. And it is very likely that this will also be elevated to its own species, Amsonia salicifolia, in the future. And then finally, my favorite is Amsonia tabernae montana variety tabernae montana, which is a mouthful. This is a beautiful plant, blooms very, very early, and this will probably be just brought back to Amsonia tabernae montana in the future, basically dropping all of the different varieties. Blooms early, sometimes in early to mid-April, has very broad leaves, ends up with kind of a coarse texture in the landscape. It almost looks like a leucothui or a leonia in the landscape when it is just in foliage. You can kind of see how different that variety is compared to some of the others next to it. And on to Amsonia blue ice and Amsonia illustris. So this is Amsonia blue ice on the left and Amsonia illustris orientalis on the right. These plants look shockingly similar, and this is just in their vegetative state. They are both rhizomatous plants, which was almost a unique trait in the trial garden. They are blooming at the exact same time, kind of end of May through June. This is what they look like in bloom. Again, blue ice, which is sometimes sold as a native plant, a selection of Amsonia tabernae montana, and Amsonia illustris, which is native to Europe. It's kind of difficult to spot the differences. Obviously, blue ice looks like it's a little bit more floriferous, a little bit more compact, but I think it's safe to say that Amsonia blue ice is a selection of Amsonia orientalis. When you see the flowers next to each other, orientalis is above, blue ice is below. Again, very, very similar. And here they are side by side. Orientalis maybe towards the more lavender end of the spectrum, blue ice towards the blue, but almost identical plants. We do not consider Amsonia orientalis to be native to even North America, that we just consider this to be a selection of Amsonia orientalis, not necessarily a bad garden plant, but certainly if you are trying to garden with native plants or plants that are native to North America in general, this is not an option for you. Carex up next. Absolutely love Carex. I'm so excited about the attention that Carex seem to be getting in cultivation and the restoration world. They are such a diverse group of plants. There's a Carex for every garden. Truly, they're an absolutely wonderful group of plants, and I'm excited to talk to you about some of our favorites and some of the best from this evaluation in these next few slides. We evaluated Carex over 4 years, and we actually did a mowing study in the 5th year. If you're interested in that mowing study, check out the research report on our website. But we looked at all 70 of these Carex in both full sun and shade. And we also, we were very interested to know, again, which of these plants would handle these very low input situations in full sun, which was sometimes out of their comfort zone, sometimes shade was, and a lot of these plants performed really well in both. So again, the 3 that I'm going to talk about today performed well in both. And one thing I wanted to talk about is, because Carex are a wind pollinated genus in general, there are of course exceptions to Carex. It means that you're not going to see that same pollinator interaction that you would see on some of our other trials like goldenrods or vernonias, but it doesn't mean that they're not supporting wildlife. So Carex are actually a host plant for a variety of butterflies and moths. We actually saw several cases of caterpillars feeding on the various Carex species in the trial garden. Carex seeds are an important food source for birds, for mammals, for seed-eating insects, and Carex themselves can actually provide valuable habitat for wildlife. They themselves can be the habitat. And we observed numerous species of arthropods, mollusks, amphibians in the trial garden, more so than we would ever see. Again, it's difficult to measure these things from a scientific perspective. Basically, like how well are certain species supporting wildlife? Are certain species better at it than others? It's difficult to measure that, but just anecdotally, we saw a lot of these wildlife interactions. And again, in cultivation, the trial garden is as artificial as you can possibly get, and we were seeing wildlife coming to this garden. And it really does show you, if you plant it, they will come. This is a caterpillar here of the yellow-collared scape moth. It was really fascinating to see this caterpillar because we knew we'd seen the adult of the species. Later on in the year, we saw the adults of this caterpillar feeding on the goldenrod trial. And this is an insect that actually has fairly specific needs as far as the plants that are going to support its larval stage and its adult stage. And we were able to support all life stages of this insect in the trial garden. Again, you can do this same exact thing at home. You can be supporting wildlife at home, even with Carex. And they're just wonderful plants. There's several more stories in the research report that I would encourage you to take a look at. Really a great group of plants. Again, not just beautiful, but they're providing value as well to wildlife. So one of our favorite and best performing species in this trial garden was Carex woodii. It has a very similar size and application to Carex pennsylvanica. And one of the things it just does a little bit better is it creates a denser mat, has shorter rhizomes, and it's better at weed suppression. This is a great alternative for kind of that green mulch, if you will, creating that base layer to your garden. It's not going to overrun other garden plants. It's going to kind of weave neatly between them. And again, creating that base layer, creating a layer of humidity for wildlife to get down there at the base layer of your garden as well. This is a rhizomatous plant. It gets to about a foot tall at the absolute highest, but most of the year it's a little bit shorter. And it increases by about a foot in diameter every year. So we ended up with about a 4-foot wide patch after 4 years of growth. The flowers of the species are extremely showy. And we didn't generally rate the flowers separately for the Carex trial as far as, giving it bonuses for ornamental appeal, but we did kind of consider that to be kind of added value, if you will. And the flowers of Carex woodii are spectacular. The foliage lasts a lot longer and is beautiful for a much longer period as well. This also has the potential for a no-mow lawn replacement. It's a great candidate for that simply because it is rhizomatous. It's going to continually grow together, and it handled the mowing trials really, really well. Actually looked very much the part of a mowed turfgrass lawn. Carex cherokeensis, really a stately species, did great in sun and shade. And this is a plant I could see used singly as a specimen. You can use it in mass. They are semi-evergreen. I think if you planted them in an area where it gets a little bit of shade from winter sun, this will probably be evergreen. And it's just a beautiful species in foliage. It kind of has these dark green, thick textured leaves. They are very shiny when you see them in person. Again, spectacular species, blooms in late April. Flowers and fruit do add a little bit of interest, but you're really growing it for that foliage. This can cover ground, it can hold soil on a slope. There's a lot of great things that this species could be doing, and it should be used more widely. And then finally, we have Carex bromoides. This is a great medium-sized plant. Reminds me a lot of Sporobolus heterolepis or prairie dropseed, but Carex bromoides has the added value of being able to be grown in both sun and shade, where Sporobolus is probably best suited for full sun. But it does a very similar thing, has a very similar texture, has these beautiful flowing leaves. Again, can be used as a base for a lot of other plantings, kind of as that base layer there. And is really well suited for moist to average soils. If you have drier conditions, there are options that give you kind of very similar aesthetics, like Carex albicans and Carex leavenworthii, but of the three, Carex bromoides was the best. Really beautiful species, again, can be planted in mass or singly as a specimen. And jumping right into wild hydrangea, this was our first evaluation on woody plants and will certainly not be our last, but we looked at 29 accessions, including 25 cultivars and 4 species. We evaluated these plants for 5 years, from 2017 to 2021, which kind of set the standard for woody plant trials. We were aiming to evaluate commercially available hydrangea arborescens at the time for horticultural value, and we also wanted to look at them when grown in full sun. We had the majority of these plants grown in shade as well, but primarily wild hydrangea are thought of as shade-growing plants, maybe edge of the woods type of plant. But we wanted to test them in this region in full sun to see how they would do. And in general, they did really well. But if you are going to be planting wild hydrangea in full sun, soil moisture is going to be very important. They don't want to dry out. And one interesting trend that we saw is any of the pink flowering forms, whether that was a lace cap hydrangea or a mophead hydrangea, and I'll talk about those two flower categories on the next slide, but the pink flowering forms fared better in full sun than their white flowering counterparts. And really, one of the major focuses of this trial, again, talking about mopheads and lace caps, we wanted to record the pollinator preference between these two very distinct floral types in the hydrangea trial. So mopheads versus lace caps. You've probably heard this term before, but lace caps are typical of wild type plants. They have far more fertile flowers than sterile flowers. You can see my cursor here. This is the lace cap hydrangea, an example of a lace cap hydrangea inflorescence. You have your sterile flowers here on the perimeter of the inflorescence, and on the interior, you have all these fertile flowers. They are producing pollen, they are producing nectar, and there are hundreds of flowers. On most hydrangea arborescens, there are between 800 and 900 individual fertile flowers per inflorescence. On some of the larger selections that produce larger inflorescences, there are upwards of 1,400. And there was even one selection in the trial garden that had about 2,000 fertile flowers per inflorescence. So that's a lot of wildlife value, that's a lot of pollinator value, all in one place, all very accessible as well. Mopheads, on the other hand, sometimes you'll hear them referred to as double-flowered forms, are plants that produce inflorescences with more sterile flowers than fertile flowers. And this has arisen in several cases as a wild mutation. Annabelle is a wild mutation. Hydrangea arborescens grandiflora is a wild mutation that was selected from the wild, again, because people thought it was attractive, but there is a sacrifice for style over substance with these plants in terms of pollinator value. Not only are there less fertile flowers, and in many cases there are still fertile flowers, there are just less of them in these mopheads. Not only are there less, but they are often kind of hidden within the inflorescences themselves, which could also have the consequence of making these flowers inaccessible to the typical pollinators that are visiting these hydrangeas. And I'll share with you some of the cases where we may have seen that actually starting to happen. So here's our pollinator data, and this is from data collected in 2019 and 2021 by the Pollinator Watch team. And the bars here on the right-hand side, the purple bars represent the lace caps, and the green bars represent the mopheads. And you can see there is a very, very strong preference for the lace cap hydrangeas by pollinators over the mophead hydrangeas, which are in the green bars here. And this really just does go to show you pollinators are showing us where the value is. If you are planting a garden for pollinators, if you're looking for a hydrangea to plant in that landscape, use a lace cap. Almost all these lace caps are supporting hundreds of insects over an entire year, and this is just a single inflorescence that's been observed. If you were to look at the entire plant, it would be thousands, if not tens of thousands. When we had the hydrangeas planted in the trial garden, they were planted in a row. One end of the row was mopheads, the other end of the row was lace caps. As you walk down, starting at the mopheads, it was kind of a quiet experience. You weren't seeing a lot of that activity, you weren't hearing that activity. And when you got into the lace caps, it got noisy. There was insects everywhere. They were bumping into you. It was this wonderful kind of magical experience seeing all of that pollinator activity that are being supported by these plants in cultivation. Now, one thing I do want to mention to you is that these pollinator preferences exist on a spectrum as well. It doesn't mean that mopheads have zero value. It just means they have a lot less. And there are no mopheads that kind of end up being at a comparable level with the lace caps. But if you really need a mophead hydrangea, you love that look, and you still want to support some pollinators, there are some options like Invincible Spirit 2, which maybe offer a little bit of a compromise. But again, if you are trying to plant for wildlife, lace caps are the best. If you're looking down here, there are a couple of purple bars down here in the bottom. Hydrangea arborescens, ribbon lace, emerald lace, and green dragon. These are 3 lace caps that attracted very, very low numbers of pollinators over those 2 years of observation. And this might seem like 3 kind of big outliers, but in reality, this is just one outlier. This is the same hydrangea that has been introduced to cultivation 3 different times and given 3 different names. So this one outlier really, or excuse me, these 3 outliers really just become one, although we're not really sure why this plant attracted so few insects compared to other lace cap hydrangeas. It's possible that the quality of the pollen, the quality of the nectar was lower. It's possible that the individual flowers were open for less time. Whatever reason, very few insects were coming to this plant. And this is a wild selected plant. So in terms of human manipulation, not heavily manipulated other than that single selection that was made in the wild, I believe in Ohio. So more to come on that, hopefully, and we'll try to understand why that single plant, why that single introduction was not attractive to pollinators. But as a general rule, lace caps are best. Hydrangea arborescens Haas Halo was, to me, the best of the best. So again, like if we are talking about plants that are ticking all the boxes, they are beautiful, we're inspiring people by the beauty of these plants, and we're inspiring people by the value of these plants, Haas Halo is doing it all. This is a plant that I saw in the trial garden. When I first saw it in bloom, I knew it was beautiful, but I saw all the pollinator activity. I bought one for myself that exact same day. So that's, again, that kind of inspiration that we're hoping to spark in our visitors. And you can come see these plants before these trials are concluded and make those decisions for yourself before we even write these research reports. Haas Halo was a rather local selection to us made by Frederick Ray, formerly of Del Valle University. And this is absolutely swarmed by pollinators in July. It has these big oversized inflorescences. Some of the cutback plants, which generally when you cut back a hydrangea, you magnify the inflorescences. We had inflorescences that were upwards of a foot in diameter, which is quite showy. It's a bigger plant, so just be aware of that when you are siting it in your landscape. Lots and lots of pollinator activity. Brief foray into Echinacea as well. We looked at 75 accessions and 70 cultivars and 5 species over a period of 3 years from 2018 to 2020. We wanted to look at all the commercially available Echinacea that we could get our hands on. We wanted to look at them for their longevity in cultivation, ornamental value. And we also wanted to know which species and cultivars had the most potential to support pollinators. We looked at 2 categories, bees and wasps together and butterflies separately. We also evaluated Echinacea from 2007 to 2009, and we incorporated some of the top performers from that evaluation in the second evaluation, in addition to all of those plants that had been recently introduced since 2009. So just a brief lesson on Echinacea anatomy. So pollinator preferred Echinacea, this has a very kind of similar comparison to the mophead versus lace cap conversation we had with hydrangeas. We will call these single or double flowers, or wild type, or compared to double flowers. On the left-hand side, we have Echinacea purpurea. This is a bisected wild type plant from a straight species. You can see all the floral parts. You can see the stigmatic surface. You can see the pollen. These are flowers, or inflorescences rather, that are offering a lot of pollen and nectar rewards to pollinators. They are all accessible. But when you look at these double flowered forms or these pom-pom type forms, a lot of times when you have a mutation that doubles a flower or is kind of giving you that extra petalous, showy inflorescence, oftentimes that is replacing a reproductive structure of that flower and likely limiting or eliminating some of that pollinator reward for pollinators, or even just simply making it less accessible. So kind of thinking of these as these 2 categories, these wild type and double flowers, in kind of a very similar way that we're thinking about the lace caps versus mopheads, we were wondering if we would see a difference in the pollinator trends between these 2 groups. And we absolutely did. The green bars represent the wild type or single flowered Echinacea. The double flowered Echinacea are the red bars down there on the end. You can see they are all attracting very low numbers of pollinators in comparison to the single or more wild type inflorescences of some of the other Echinacea. The highest, the most visited Echinaceas tended to be Echinacea purpurea and its selections. So again, we tend to see the straight species being utilized the most by pollinators. This is kind of what I consider to be the gold standard. But then also selections often hold a lot of that value as well. And I do think of cultivars, it is a very huge and complicated topic. There's a lot of plants that get kind of enveloped underneath that cultivar topic. You have plants that are selections of the species, so they actually are the species, may not be diverse genetically, but that's kind of a whole nother conversation. But this is an example of a wild type plant that has been selected by people, so relatively little influence by people, not a lot of manipulation. On the other hand, we have complex hybrids that are continually selected, and those are the plants that we see have a decreased number of insects going to them and likely decreased value, especially when the flowers themselves are being changed, the structure is being changed in some fundamental way. But again, Echinacea purpurea and its cultivars and selections kind of dominated the top 15 of the Echinacea here in terms of numbers of pollinators we were seeing. One of the best, again, the plant that is great from a pollinator perspective, great from a garden perspective, was Echinacea purpurea picobella. This was the top performing plant from that first trial and the second trial as well. It's just basically a more compact form of Echinacea purpurea, and it performed really well with pollinators as well. Up next is Phlox. This evaluation took place from 2015 to 2017. We looked at 94 different Phlox, 86 cultivars, and 8 species. And we really wanted to evaluate commercially available Phlox. We wanted to look at some underrepresented species, and we wanted to determine which of these Phlox were attracting the most pollinators, specifically which Phlox were attracting the most butterflies. And the one Phlox that attracted by far the most butterflies of any Phlox in the entire trial was Phlox paniculata gina. It attracted 539 butterflies compared to the next closest Phlox, which is Phlox paniculata lavelle, which only attracted 117. And 117 is still a ton of butterflies, but Gina is absolutely covered by butterflies in the trial garden, in the rest of Mount Cuba Center where it's planted in our formal gardens. This is a great selection of the species. This is a wild type plant that was selected in Tennessee and is absolutely one of the favorites by butterflies and the gardens of Mount Cuba Center. This is one of those plants, if you plant Phlox paniculata gina, you are very likely going to get butterflies in your home landscape. It also had the added benefit of being the best performing Phlox in the trial from a horticultural perspective. It stood up straight, never had any issues with flopping, never had any issues with powdery mildew. If I could only plant one Phlox paniculata at home, if I had very limited space, Phlox paniculata gina would be the plant that I would choose. And finally, a brief presentation on some of the top performing Monarda. We looked at 40 different accessions, including 34 cultivars and 6 species from 2014 to 2016. We were very interested in kind of the same questions that we were looking at with the Phlox trial. We wanted to highlight some underrepresented species, look for plants with powdery mildew resistance. We also wanted to know which of these plants were supporting the most butterflies and moths and which were supporting the most hummingbirds. In terms of their ability to attract hummingbirds, Monarda diadema Jacob Klein was a runaway. So hummingbirds really do prefer those red flowers, those long floral tubes, and Monarda diadema Jacob Klein just attracted more hummingbirds than anything else. Didn't quite get to the top performer list as far as horticultural performance, and that was mostly because it did get some powdery mildew. But for me, I'm planting most of these plants in my home garden based on their ability to support wildlife and cultivation. I'm going to choose Jacob Klein every single time. I'm willing to forgive a little bit of powdery mildew. Maybe I'll put it in the back of my border. But if I'm going to see that number of hummingbirds, and I absolutely do on this selection, this is a really, really great plant to include in your garden. As far as preferred Monarda by butterflies and moths, they preferred the shorter floral tubes of Monarda fistulosa, and their favorite was Monarda fistulosa Claire Grace. Claire Grace was the top performer from this evaluation as well from a horticultural perspective. It was a great upright plant, no powdery mildew issues at all, nice dark stems, nice clean dark foliage, and darker pink and purple flowers. Really great selection of the species. Again, if you could only have 1 or 2 Monardas in your garden, I would choose Claire Grace and Jacob Klein. And with that, thank you so much for having me. I hope we have some time for questions. Again, please reach out if you have any additional questions as well.
Wow. Thank you, Sam. That was amazing. Who's ready to go plant all the things? That makes me excited for spring. We have some questions from the chat, and then I'm sure there are more questions. Sam, we could start with some easy softball ones, or we could get right to it. What are you feeling?
Either way, it's totally fine.
Well, somebody asked what the best month to visit Mount Cuba is. I bet that's a hard question to answer.
It is a hard question. It kind of depends on what you're interested in. If you want to see spring ephemerals kind of at their peak, end of April is probably the best time to come here. You'll see we have a large collection of spring ephemerals, including one of our core collections, which is Trillium. They've actually started to come up already, which is a little bit crazy, but late April, mid to late April is a really good time to come here. And we actually have our Mount Cuba Center's Spring Open House Day, which is, I believe, the third weekend in April, which is a great time to come. The Trial Garden is probably at its peak kind of in summer, July, August. We'll have our oak leaf hydrangeas blooming. We'll have the pycnanthemum blooming. My personal favorite time in the gardens are probably October, early November. Seeing the fall color, all the textures in the meadows and in the natural lands. There's not a bad time to come, but really your window is from April 3rd to about Thanksgiving. I tend to like the fall, but there is no bad time to come here.
Thank you. Let's see. Barbara had a couple of questions, a little more technical, and I'm going to mispronounce this. I'm sorry. Okay. But well, first of all, do trial plants hybridize? And then she asked if you had considered trying a specific species of plant that I'll butcher, Sisyrinchium.
Sisyrinchium. Yeah, we haven't done them yet. I could definitely see doing kind of what we've been doing with some of these smaller trials, like with Physostegia, is a lot of our previous evaluations have been with larger genera or with groups of plants where there's a lot of cultivars present. So our model for evaluations are groups that we can get 40 or 70 different plants to compare side by side. With Sisyrinchium, it might be slightly less, but we are starting to do trials where we might only be able to get 6 or a dozen plants together and start to evaluate them. We know some Sisyrinchium are great plants. They could be great in a no-mow lawn situation. There's a lot of great value with that genus, so I could definitely see doing an evaluation on them in the future. And the other question was about hybrids. We do include hybrids, but they have to be of 2 native species, and they're kind of that third layer of comparison for us that I think about between the straight species, cultivars, and then hybrids kind of beyond that.
One more, not too difficult one. Can Vernonia be chopped, like Chelsea chopped, to keep it shorter?
They absolutely can. We did that the past couple of years. The plants that tend to be taller with the really thick stems, you can chop them, but that secondary growth tends to be a little bit weak. And during a lot of rain or a really windy day, that secondary growth right where it's broken from the previous stem can break right at that union quite easily. But there are plants that are smaller anyways and have finer foliage, like Vernonia lettermanii or angustifolia, that handle the cutback really well. And actually, one of the complaints of iron butterfly, which is a very popular and available cultivar of Vernonia lettermanii, one of the things it's known for is eventually flopping and having kind of an open center, especially if you're growing it in an area with a little bit of extra moisture and nutrients. If you give it that Chelsea chop, it fixes that problem completely. So a lot of our gardeners do that same thing with asters that kind of gives them a little more of a compact look throughout the year. I would absolutely add lettermanii iron butterfly to that list of plants that, it's just kind of a good idea to give it the chop if you want to have a full habit for the rest of the season.
Okay, Sam, could you get into nativar, cultivar? There were a couple questions about some people are proponents of local ecotype only. Yep. Is that warranted? Does Mount Cuba have a stance on that?
No, I think that's an admirable, and it's maybe the gold standard. And I think that's something that a lot of us can work towards. There are a couple issues with it, however, and it's not that it's the wrong thing to do. I think it can be difficult for people who are getting involved into the native plant conversation to start there. That's maybe where people who are experts and really are experienced in this cultivating native plants will get to, or at least we would hope that they would get to. But getting local ecotype seed can be a challenge. Knowing how to ethically collect it yourself and start it yourself can also be a challenge, but those are all challenges that can be surmounted. But I think cultivars are a great way to get people involved in the native plant conversation, to get people inspired so that they can start opening that topic for themselves and taking that deeper dive. And I think that starting with local ecotype, all straight species, again, it can be somewhat challenging. Especially if you don't have a lot of space. We do target this like to anybody. And it's not just the people who have room or people who don't live in an HOA where that might be a problem if you are growing plants like that or gardens like that. I always think about developments, right? When you see a new development of plants, what do you see being planted in those developments? Like non-native meatball shrubs, almost nothing. And we think about like the native plant conversation as being a spectrum here. If we can get someone to plant an echinacea, even if it's a cultivar, even if it's not going to give you the exact same benefits of that straight species, that's still better than planting burning bush. So we do think of it as conservation by addition. We want people to get involved. We want people to understand that even by planting a native plant, they are adding to the world in a positive way. And maybe they'll get there with the straight species, locally selected, locally sourced seeds. And I really hope that becomes more available in the future. Certain parts of the world or certain parts of our country are getting better. There's more availability. There are places like Nasami Farm in New England where they are growing those local ecotype plants. You can buy those. I would love to have a place around here that I could do that. Accessibility becomes an issue. And in most cases, cultivars are the most accessible plant for beginners. So that's kind of how I think about this. But again, I never want to demean somebody by saying like, oh, you planted a cultivar, that's not as good. It may not be as good, but it's not bad either. It is, I'd really think of it as a spectrum. So there's a lot of gray in there. It's not all black and white. It's not all or nothing. At least that's the way we think of it here.
So people are mentioning in the chat that we do have Earth Songa in our area, and they do local ecotypes.
And that's great. So, and I think the more we demand this stuff, the more producers are going to realize that this is a market where we can actually make money. I think that's the biggest things we have to prove to nurseries that they can make money by selling locally sourced seed, locally sourced plants. And it's going to happen. I really think we're moving that direction. It's really encouraging some of these places that I'm seeing that are offering more and more of this stuff. But we kind of, as gardeners, we have to create this demand too. So often we hear from nurseries like, nobody wants this stuff. We're not hearing the demand. And then you hear from the consumers like, nobody's selling this. Like, what's going on? I'm like, we all need to talk so we can actually prove to the nurseries that we want this stuff, which I think we do. And I think as people become more educated in the native plant world, the demand is only going to grow. So I really do hope to see this kind of stuff. I think we're going to see this continue and get more and more available. But I do think of cultivars as sometimes almost that gateway drug, if you will.
I was going to use that phrase and I wasn't sure that was okay. Gateway drug.
Sure.
Judy is on, and Judy is one of our tech people at the Conservation District, and she's been answering a lot of questions about where to find native plants to purchase and everything. But she asked if you include straight species as a comparison for pollinator preference to the cultivars in trial.
Almost always, as often as we possibly can, that's our baseline. And that's what we want to compare everything to. And most recently, we've actually been trying to add another layer to that. We've been trying to add a local ecotype, known origin straight species as our real baseline. And then we'll source the straight species from a source that we may not know the ecotype of that plant. We may not know where it came from. That would be that second layer of comparison. I always talk about how wonderful places like Prairie Moon are, but Prairie Moon's located in the upper Midwest. So it's like, how appropriate is that plant for us? In some cases, it's accessible. To me, it's another good starting point. But when you look at our local ecotypes, these plants that are coming from Delaware, from Maryland, southeastern Pennsylvania, southern New Jersey, is that similar? Is that the same? Are pollinators going to be coming to that plant at the same rates as our local ecotypes? I think that's another layer of comparison we're kind of missing. We often talk about straight species and cultivars, and those are those two categories. To me, there's that third of that straight species that we don't know where it came from. And I think, again, when we're trying to generate demand with nurseries, generate that demand with known origin genetics as well, not just straight species, because sometimes a straight species could be produced in the exact same way a cultivar is being produced, especially woody plants. If they have one plant that they take cuttings from over and over and over, that's a cultivar in all ways except for a name. So it's just, yeah, there's a lot of layers to this, but as often as possible, we are trying to source local genetics, straight species as our baseline that we compare the straight species unknown genetics to, and then cultivars and hybrids after that.
We did have a question about deer. You're
Sure.
probably overrun with deer as well.
Yes,
most of the eastern United States.
It's a major
I don't know
consideration.
I don't know what the answer to that might be. Yep,
it's tough.
We have a deer problem.
I think Mount Cuba at the Trial Garden specifically, we are maybe a little bit unfairly protected. So we do have a deer fence, and we even have a smaller fence that'll keep out rabbits and groundhogs from the Trial Garden. So not a realistic analogy to what I have at home, just a couple miles away. I don't have a deer fence. I have lots of deer. And that's something we've recognized as kind of a shortcoming of the trials. And it's something we're trying to remedy through partners. We've actually been we've been working with Temple University, sharing some of our trials with them, and they're planting these trials out in places that they have very high deer pressure, known deer populations. And they're trying to see which of these plants might be resistant to deer browse and which might not. We did that with our goldenrod trials, and we're doing that with a few trials coming up. And with the goldenrods, they're actually seeing some preferential feeding. So between these 70 different plants that are in the goldenrod trial, there are some that are turning out to be quite resistant to deer and some that maybe not so. Deer resistance is relative, though. What might be resistant for me might not be resistant in Mount Cuba Center. It seems like some years deer have a taste for something and other years they don't. There are plants in general, though, that are extremely resistant. Amsonia is one of them, which is one of the reasons I love Amsonia for my home garden, because they are tough as nails and because they are deer resistant. I have an area of my garden that is a deer highway. And I've learned that Amsonia can go out there, they're untouched, and it's just some of those things you just have to work with what you've got. And Amsonia are great for that. So looking at plants that really have a high deer resistance, I do a lot for my hydrangeas. They're known to be kind of deer candy, especially when they're young. What I've learned is just I have to cage those young plants till they can get to a big enough size where they can handle some of that browse. You just kind of have to work with it as best you can. But it is something we're looking at in Mount Cuba Center to provide some better data on the future.
There are a couple of questions and I know some of this information is on your website as well, but could you just touch on, just because a plant is native to your area, there are still differences within your yard as far as soil and moisture and sunlight and everything. You still have some work to do. Can you just touch on finding the right plant for the right spot?
Exactly. And a lot of this, it is the right plant for the right place. And the place that we're evaluating it is somewhat specific. We do consider the soils to be similar to many garden soils in the mid-Atlantic region, but it won't be all. So if you go to coastal plain in New Jersey, it's going to be very sandy soils. We have kind of this clay loam, fairly moisture retentive, fairly high nutrients, pH between 6 and 7. And that soil is homogeneous throughout the trial garden. So we are basically seeing the performance of these plants in this single soil condition. And that means that the plants that we're going to be promoting are the ones that are most adaptable or best suited for that condition specifically. But when we're looking at a trial of species, so like with Carex or even Solidago or Vernonia, there is not a bad species at all. It's just which ones are performing well in these conditions. And with some of them, like Vernonia noveboracensis, our locally native ironweed, great plant, especially if you have a lot of moisture, if you have an area where you can have a cool, moist root zone, that plant's going to do beautifully for you. But in the trial garden, it struggled. It just didn't have enough water. The root zones weren't cool enough. And it didn't rate well, but we don't want to tell people don't plant this. If you have the right conditions, it's perfect. So it is right plant, right place, but we are trying to get, capture as much of the average as we possibly can, and then tell those stories about where this plant could work in the right condition. So more to come on that, but especially with a species heavy trial, there's no bad plant. And we tried to talk about that a little bit with the Carex. We have a downloadable chart where you can basically use your soil conditions or use the aesthetic values you want from those Carex and sort them and generate lists for yourself. So if you have dry, sandy soils, you can sort for those. If you have wet, sunny, clay soils or whatever, you can sort for those soil conditions, those sun exposures, and you can generate lists for yourself. And those lists may not be the top performing plants, but they might be the best plants for you. So more to come on that. But again, no bad species. It is just right plant, right place.
Liz asks if you plan to do any trials with native plant communities versus
yes,
the monocultures.
We do. It's coming. It's going to take a little bit of time. What I kind of think about what we're doing is we're collecting all these components, right? All these ingredients to make these mixed plantings. I think Carex was really important for that when we're going to be doing mixed plantings in shade. Ferns, same deal. And that's one of the reasons we're doing this fern study, so we can have all these ingredients from all these various trials, eventually combine them together, see how they perform together over time, show people how they're going to perform, how they're going to evolve, what kind of maintenance they're going to need to expect for those first few years to get those plantings established, what kind of wildlife interaction we're going to see. Are some of these going to be more biodiverse, have a bigger, more biodiverse wildlife interaction than others? There's a lot of things that we can incorporate in that. It's one of the reasons we're doing this grasses trial as well, because that to me is a really important component to kind of these meadow and sunny plantings. But yes, we are thinking very seriously about doing that. And I think it will probably be in the next few years, we'll start our first kind of meadow combinations or matrix plantings that we're going to be evaluating as groups, in addition to woody plants as well. So stay tuned for that. More like trees and edibles and things like that, like pawpaws. Yeah, there's a lot of things that we want to do. But I do kind of, one of the reasons that I highlight the aerial view of the trial garden is it's a lot smaller than some people expect to see. And it is myself, I'm full-time, and my coworker who's part-time. And that's it. And we rely very heavily on volunteers to maintain the garden and to collect that pollinator data. But I think really to start looking at some of these bigger questions, we'll need more space, we'll need more staff, which will probably happen in the next few years.
That's exciting.
Yeah, it's very exciting. There's a lot of really cool things I'm very hopeful that we get to.
A question about a hydrangea arborescens that did not have mop head flowers. Does that mean they were not what they were sold as? Did she get hoodwinked?
Maybe, and I will say, we had that happen with the oak leaf trial. We bought in a lot of smaller plants, 1 to 3 gallon plants. They didn't bloom the first year. We actually deadheaded them the first year to kind of encourage them to put down more roots. And when we saw them bloom the next year, there were some that the flowers were not as advertised. It does happen. But if you are interested in supporting wildlife, if you've got that lace cap, might be a good thing. But totally up to you. And again, we present this data for you to be able to make good informed decisions based on your garden goals. If your garden goals are to support wildlife, maybe ignore the top performer section and look specifically at the pollinator section. That's really what I do when I'm selecting plants for home. It is, again, about making those informed decisions, and we're trying to give you that data to do that. But if you want to take a look at our research report for the hydrangeas, if you really want those mop heads, if you love that look, if it's a nostalgic thing for you, which I think it is for a lot of us, seeing that at grandma's house or something like that, or trips to the Cape, you see hydrangeas. There are great options that there are some horticulturally superior forms of mop heads now that are better than, some of the heirloom selections like Annabelle or Grandiflora. There are some good options out there today.
On that note, Ivy asked about oak leaf hydrangea, which I think I just discovered recently. I think are gorgeous, but yes. She said, I assume they count as mop heads and aren't as pollinator friendly. You didn't mention them? So they don't.
they don't have the kind of those two distinct categories of kind of that as the lace cap or mop head. They have panicles, so kind of cone-shaped inflorescences, but they do have a similar spectrum of fertile flowers to sterile flowers. Some of the straight species will have a lot of fertile flowers kind of underneath those sterile flowers, so a lot of value for pollinators. You'll see a ton of insect activity, but some of them are, I would say, probably the term doubles is most accurate. A lot of those doubles have very few, if any, fertile flowers at all. And I think even from a horticultural perspective, they're not the best. Those flowers tend to be very heavy and they end up flopping over. But more to come on that. Our first pollinator studies with the oak leaf trial will be this year. But there is a spectrum of fertile to sterile flowers, and not all are great for pollinators, but certainly some are.
That makes me sad.
Yeah, I would say like the big like Vaughn's lily or anyways, if you come to the trial garden, you'll be able to see very clearly which of these plants are attracting insects and which are not, even without the data. I think it's going to be a much clearer difference. It's going to be a lot more black and white than the hydrangea arborescens trial, where there was a spectrum on many of the mop heads. There are some fertile flowers. On the oak leaf hydrangeas, it seems like there's some or none. But more to come on that.
I am planning personally my trip already. I've not been there, so definitely on my list.
Let us know. Yeah, anyone in this presentation, if you arrange a group trip or if you're coming up, let us know. We'd love to have you.
Great. I think I've hit all the questions in the chat. Does anybody else have a question that I did not get to or that they have thought of? If you want to raise your hand and unmute, you are welcome to ask. Also, or Heather, could you put Sam's email back in the chat so that if anybody thinks of something later they wanted to ask, he said you're welcome to email him.
Yes, please do. Happy to chat about the trials. And check out the website too. There's some great educational offerings that are, any time of year. You don't have to wait for us to be open to engage in that Cuba Center. We've been doing a lot more virtual offerings of classes. There's also in-person opportunities. There's a really great lineup this year. Our education team's really, I think, doing some fabulous work. And I'll be teaching a few classes this year. We're going to be teaching a couple in-person Amsonia classes, a couple in-person Vernonia classes, and a couple classes in the summer on monarchs and milkweed. So there's a lot coming up. But yeah, we'd love to see you.
You're getting a lot of thank you for the awesome presentation in the chat. So pass those on.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Trish and Sam, I'm not sure I have your email address, Sam. So
sorry, Heather.
Yeah.
Here, I can.
And we had somebody raise their hand. Is there a question? Raise their hand and then put it back down. So any questions or announcements from anyone about upcoming events they'd like to share? Barbara? I can try to, you can unmute yourself or I can try to unmute you.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted. It took a minute.
You are. You are.
Plants are growing together. Do they themselves hybridize? In the trial?
Yes, some do. And some trials are more, if you will, promiscuous than others. Amsonia are known for that. They will hybridize. If you have more than one species next to each other, you will very likely end up with intermediate hybrids. Vernonia is known for that as well. In theory, some carex can hybridize, and that's known to happen in the wild as well, especially carex within the same section. It does happen, and it can happen in cultivation. And in some cases, that's something that plant breeders will exploit. But if you're looking for the straight species, if you really want like a pure species form of something like Amsonia from a nursery, I would just check with them and make sure that they only have they have pure seedling blocks where they don't have multiple species present that could be hybridizing. But it is a consideration for sure.
Yeah, thanks. It could be a good thing, maybe at some point something great could happen.
It could. I think we've probably weeded out hundreds and thousands of plants that plant breeders would have absolutely loved. It could have been the next great thing. But yeah, our goal, even when we do introduce plants from time to time, but they're always selections of the species. We aren't hybridizing anything. Anytime we do introduce something, it's the straight species or a selection of.
Thanks so much.
Thank
Ivy
you.
suggested you have a pollinator study done on golden ragwort. She said it's flourishing in her garden.
Yeah, there's a lot of things we can do, and it's very exciting, the prospect of partnerships with places like UD, University of Delaware, who are very close to us, with Rutgers. There's a lot we really are excited to do, and I'm hoping we get there.
I'm sure there's more than you could ever imagine
Oh yes,
doing.
I wish we had like 10 PhD students at any time working with us. But yeah, it's exciting. The Pollinator Watch team, I can't sing their praises enough. They really allow us to do what we do, and I think we're starting to get better and more relevant data all the time.
And I did find your email address, Sam, and I
Okay.
put it in the chat a couple of times. It's near the bottom, and I added
Perfect.
it again. So in case anybody needs to reach out.
Sounds great. Thank you.
It is about 10:30, which is about when we usually wrap up. So unless there are any last questions, that was amazing, informative and gorgeous and exciting. And I think we're all excited about getting out there in our gardens now. Thank you, Sam.
You're very welcome. And thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure. Hopefully we'll see you in the garden soon.
I hope so. Oh, goodness. Steve, I'm sorry I missed your question. Are there staff members at Mount Cuba who will give personalized advice on our gardens if we visit? Oh, well.
Yeah, I don't know a whole lot about it, but if you send me an email, I'll direct you to the right place. We have, I think they're called garden coaches still, but they are people who will help you kind of make good decisions based on your personal needs.
I know master gardeners will do that, I believe.
Yeah. Yep.
And
it's
they
kind of
do
our
plant
version
clinics
of that. Yeah. Yep.
Okay. All right. I think we're going to wrap it up, and Sam's email is in the chat for anyone who has further questions. And thank you so much.
Thanks again.
And everyone,
Take care.
our next Green Breakfast will be May 11th. Hope to see you then. And have a great day, everybody.